Why are immigrants often blamed for rising crime? Is it true or just political theater? What the real data shows may surprise you. In American political discourse, few topics provoke as much controversy and emotion as immigration. And one of the most persistent, emotionally charged claims is that immigrants, especially those who are undocumented, are responsible for a disproportionate share of crime in the United States. This claim is echoed in speeches, political ads, and on cable news. But does it actually align with reality? To begin unpacking this, let's start with the core assumption that immigration and crime go hand in hand. For decades, many Americans have believed that more immigrants lead to more crime. But when we turn to the hard numbers, the kind collected and analyzed over years by researchers, law enforcement agencies, and independent think tanks, the picture looks very different. Numerous studies from institutions such as the Cato Institute, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and the American Immigration Council show that immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit crimes at significantly lower rates than native-born U.S. citizens. A comprehensive study from the Cato Institute in Texas, published in 2018, found that the criminal conviction rate for undocumented immigrants was nearly 50% lower than that of native-born citizens. Legal immigrants had an even lower rate. This trend is not new. Over the past 3 decades, crime rates in the United States have dropped dramatically, while immigration, both legal and unauthorized, has increased. From the early 1990s to the mid-2010s, violent crime in America fell by nearly half, while the foreign-born population more than doubled. If immigration fueled crime, the numbers should have moved in the same direction, not in opposite ones. Yet the perception that immigrants cause crime persists. One reason is selective media coverage. When an immigrant is involved in a serious crime, especially if that individual is undocumented, it receives disproportionate attention. Politicians and media outlets often spotlight these cases to stoke fear or drive a particular agenda. For instance, the tragic killing of Kate Steinle in San Francisco in 2015 by an undocumented immigrant became a national flashpoint. The incident was repeatedly cited by then-presidential candidate Donald Trump to argue for stricter immigration enforcement in the construction of a border wall. But researchers caution against drawing broad conclusions from singular incidents. Data from the Department of Justice and local law enforcement consistently show that immigrants, on average, are less likely to be incarcerated, less likely to be arrested for violent crimes, and more likely to be contributing members of society. Despite this, the political narrative around immigrants and crime remains deeply polarized. In recent years, some states have attempted to pass legislation under the assumption that immigration increases crime. For example, Arizona's controversial SB 1070 law, passed in 2010, granted police the authority to detain individuals suspected of being in the country illegally. The law was later partially struck down by the Supreme Court, but it reflected a broader trend of criminalizing immigration based on perception rather than evidence. One lesser-known detail is how immigrants themselves often become victims of crime, especially when they are undocumented. Fear of deportation discourages many from reporting crimes or cooperating with law enforcement. This makes them vulnerable to exploitation, human trafficking, and workplace abuse. The irony is stark. While the public debate focuses on immigrants as potential threats, the data shows they are more often the ones who need protection. Furthermore, there is a growing body of evidence that immigrant communities tend to be more stable and less prone to violence than is commonly assumed. Research from the University of California, Irvine, found that neighborhoods with higher concentrations of immigrants often experience lower levels of crime. The explanation is partly cultural. Many immigrants come from communities with strong family and social ties, and partly practical. Immigrants who work hard to establish a life in the U.S. are typically motivated to avoid legal trouble that could result in deportation. Another underreported aspect is how crime statistics are often misused or misunderstood. Federal crime data usually does not distinguish between native-born and immigrant offenders, especially when it comes to immigration status. This leads to confusion and opens the door for political manipulation. In 2018, the Trump administration launched a new office within the Department of Homeland Security, the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement, VOICE, to highlight crimes committed by immigrants. However, critics argued that it distorted public understanding by focusing only on crimes committed by non-citizens, ignoring broader context and crime trends. Immigration and crime are complex topics that defy easy answers. But one thing is clear: the evidence does not support the claim that immigrants are more dangerous than native-born citizens. On the contrary, the data consistently shows that immigrants are less likely to engage in criminal behavior. Still, the emotional weight of crime stories, combined with the fear of the unknown, makes this a potent political issue. Politicians from both sides have used it to galvanize their base. Some Democrats, especially in border states, have supported increased border security or taken a hard line on illegal entry, not necessarily because they believe in a strong link between immigration and crime, but because the political cost of appearing soft on the issue is too high. Meanwhile, many Republicans have used the crime narrative to push for broader restrictions on legal immigration and justify harsh enforcement tactics. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how specific political figures have manipulated this narrative, the consequences of those policies on immigrant communities, and why, despite the overwhelming data, the myth linking immigrants to crime continues to thrive in American society. As the political spotlight intensified on immigration during the late 2010s and early 2020s, crime remained one of the most powerful rhetorical tools used by candidates, particularly during election cycles. The fear-based messaging was often not backed by statistical reality, yet it found resonance among large swaths of the electorate. One of the most high-profile examples was the rhetoric and policies of the Trump administration. Starting with his 2015 campaign launch, where he claimed that Mexico was sending rapists and criminals into the United States, Trump consistently used the supposed connection between immigrants and crime to frame his broader immigration agenda. He invoked violent incidents involving undocumented immigrants at rallies and during televised speeches, often highlighting anecdotal stories without acknowledging national crime trends. His administration's policies reflected this narrative. The creation of the Voice Office, the implementation of family separations at the border, the increase in workplace immigration raids, and attempts to end DACA were all framed, at least in part, as measures to enhance public safety. Yet internal government reviews and independent studies found that these policies did little to curb crime, and in some cases may have made immigrant communities more vulnerable and isolated. What's often missing from public discourse is the real-world impact on immigrant families and communities. Policies rooted in fear, not facts, led to situations where legal immigrants avoided calling the police, undocumented workers hesitated to go to the hospital after being attacked, and U.S. citizens living in mixed-status households lived in constant anxiety. Children of immigrants, regardless of legal status, grew up in an atmosphere of suspicion and threat. For example, a 2019 study from the University of Michigan found that in counties where immigration and customs enforcement, ICE raids increased, reports of domestic violence and sexual assault dropped significantly, not because those crimes decreased, but because victims feared coming forward. Law enforcement officials in multiple cities, including Los Angeles, Houston, and Denver, publicly expressed concern that aggressive federal immigration tactics were undermining public safety by deterring cooperation from immigrant residents. Even within law enforcement, the idea that immigrants increase crime is disputed. In many cities, police chiefs and sheriffs have resisted cooperating with ICE unless legally required, arguing that local trust is essential to solving crimes and protecting communities. In 2017, the Major Cities Chiefs Association stated unequivocally that federal immigration enforcement is not the mission of local police, warning that entangling police and immigration matters damages community relationships and leads to underreporting of crime. One of the most overlooked facts in this debate is how expensive and ineffective many enforcement policies have been. Billions of dollars have been poured into border security, detention centers, and deportation operations. Yet the clearest evidence still shows no consistent link between increased immigration enforcement and reductions in violent or property crime. Meanwhile, the broader political landscape has shifted. During the Biden administration, immigration policy was reshaped to focus more on humanitarian concerns, family reunification, and reversing some of the Trump-era measures. However, the crime narrative did not vanish. It simply evolved. Conservative politicians and media outlets continued to link immigration with crime, particularly when covering border crossings, fentanyl trafficking, or violent crimes involving non-citizens. In 2024, Republican candidates again centered immigration and crime in their campaigns, despite clear counter-evidence from law enforcement and public health officials indicating that most drugs enter the U.S. through legal ports of entry and that immigrants are less likely to commit violent crimes than U.S.-born individuals. Another critical dimension is the influence of misinformation and social media. Studies from the Brookings Institution and Pew Research Center show that false or misleading claims about immigrant crime spread faster and receive more engagement than factual corrections. When a violent crime is committed by an immigrant, it is often framed as evidence of a systemic threat. When a similar crime is committed by a native-born citizen, it rarely receives national political attention. This asymmetry fuels fear and reinforces stereotypes, creating a distorted public perception that shapes policy decisions. Despite decades of research debunking the immigrant crime connection, polls continue to show that large segments of the American public believe immigrants increase crime. Why? Because narrative is often more powerful than data. When fear is amplified by emotional stories, political soundbites, and sensationalist media, even the most well-documented facts can struggle to compete. Yet there are signs of change. More city governments and local law enforcement agencies are working to build trust with immigrant communities. Universities and advocacy groups continue to publish and promote factual research, and some media outlets are beginning to focus more critically on the misuse of crime statistics in immigration debates. But the battle over perception is far from over. Immigration remains a wedge issue, and crime continues to be one of the most emotionally potent components of that debate. As we head into the next election cycle, the question is not whether the immigrant crime narrative will resurface. It will. The real question is whether voters will demand evidence over fear, facts over fiction. So here's what we're left with. If the data consistently shows that immigrants commit fewer crimes, that their communities are often safer, and that enforcement policies based on fear can do more harm than good, why does the myth still persist? What do you think is keeping this narrative alive? Let us know in the comments.